For anyone born between 1975 and 2005, there's a phantom limb sensation on the high street. It had that very specific shade of green text above the door. That was the Early Learning Center, the place to be for parents who wanted their kids to play with toys specifically designed to make them smarter. Today though, that brand has effectively been wiped off the map. Well, that's just tough luck, isn't it? We've seen that before with companies like Toys R Us effectively unable to compete with the likes of Amazon. That's on top of kids preferring iPads to physical toys. But here's the thing, the Early Learning Center isn't dead. It's actually more profitable, more efficient, and more widely available than it was 10 years ago. That's all because it did something that almost no other legacy retailer managed to do. It looked at its own business model of renting expensive shops on high streets to sell low-margin toys and realized that the business model wasn't going to work in the long run. So it changed course. What we're witnessing with ELC is one of the most successful, stealthy pivots in modern British business history. It's the story of how a company went from losing millions of pounds a year to thriving amidst a retail apocalypse. The Early Learning Center was never just a toy shop. When John Beale founded it in 1974, he wasn't chasing scale or spectacle. The idea grew out of a personal frustration with the toy market itself. Shelves packed with noise, plastic, and distraction, but very little that felt genuinely designed to support how children learn and develop. The frustration made perfect sense in its moment. By the early 1970s, the toy industry was in the grip of a plastic revolution defined by mass production. Walking into a department store back then meant being assaulted by a cacophony of neon colors, cheap injection molded plastic, and battery-operated noise. It was the dawn of the action figure boom where the industry was aggressively pivoting away from play and moving toward merchandising, turning toys into disposable media tie-ins. This commercial noise was exactly what frustrated John Beale. As a father surveying those aisles, he saw nothing but distraction and a distinct lack of anything designed to actually help a child's brain develop. That frustration birthed a specific, perhaps slightly snobbish but deeply effective philosophy. Toys should be batteries not required. It was this conviction that led him to build a business that positioned these products as essential instruments for early learning, elevating them far above the status of simple playthings. Parents walking into the Early Learning Center were effectively purchasing the feeling of being a good parent. You wouldn't mind paying £15 for a wooden bus because that wooden bus was going to make your toddler smarter. Beale initially launched this venture as a mail order business from a basement near Reading. However, the sheer volume of demand quickly forced his hand, leading him to open the first physical shop in Reading later that same year. ELC spaces were designed to be calm, featuring wooden shelving and play tables set specifically at toddler height, which allowed for a radical try before you buy concept implemented decades before the Apple Store made it famous, effectively treating the child as a serious customer. We also have to remember that in the pre-internet world of 1974, there were no mummy blogs or online reviews or TikTok toy reviews to guide these decisions. In that era, finding the best developmental tools meant putting your full faith in a company, and John Beale succeeded because he built a brand that was like a wise schoolteacher. Riding the economic wave of the 1980s and 90s, the Early Learning Center cemented itself as a genuine cultural institution. As the British middle class expanded, so did a specific type of parental anxiety about child development. Toys aren't merely for fun. They shape imagination, skills, and growth. And ELC understood this, creating toys that foster learning through play and showing that toys can be powerful tools for development, not just fun. By the turn of the millennium, this formula had spawned over 215 stores, solidifying the brand's position as a leading toy company, if you could call it that. Parents would let their kids lose themselves at the wooden train tables while they browsed. Among its product portfolio was Happyland, a range launched in the 1990s that became one of the brand's most iconic toy lines. You couldn't pick it up at Woolworths or find a cheaper version elsewhere. This vertical integration allowed them to control the entire margin, bypassing the heavy cuts taken by manufacturers like Lego or Mattel. The margins were excellent, yet the entire business model hinged on parents making a dedicated pilgrimage to the high street paying for parking and walking through the door specifically to buy a puzzle. This monopoly on attention held firm for decades, but the ground was shifting beneath them. The beginning of the end can be traced back to a specific check signed in June 2007. Mothercare, the massive maternity retailer, decided to buy the Early Learning Center. The deal made perfect sense for Mothercare as it allowed them to prolong a customer in their ecosystem. Typically, their customers stay with them from pregnancy up until the kid was about 3 years old. After that, they lost them. By buying ELC, they could extend that customer life cycle up to age 8, and they paid £85 million for the privilege. The business press in 2007 was unanimous in its praise, hailing the deal as a synergistic masterpiece designed to forge a genuine parenting superpower. Unfortunately for Mothercare, this was just months away from the global financial crisis which decimated disposable income, turning that £85 million price tag into a heavy financial anchor around their neck. To make matters worse, the physical integration was handled clumsily. Mothercare began closing the beloved standalone ELC shops and shoving them inside their own superstores. They took what had been a wonderland for children and reduced it to a sterile concession stand wedged between pumps and nappy bins, stripping away the very sense of destination that made the brand special. Yet, the biggest threat was the inescapable weight of the lease structure. Mothercare had acquired a massive physical footprint with long-term financial commitments, meaning that even as they frantically closed stores to stop the bleeding, they were still on the hook for the expensive rent. And just as they were grappling with this real estate crisis, the smartphone arrived to change retail forever. This was the screen time revolution. The launch of the iPhone in 2007 and the iPad in 2010 fundamentally rewired the parenting toolkit. The heavy bag of physical distractions was swapped for a single glowing screen. Parents were suddenly left asking why they should spend £15 on a wooden abacus when a 99p app could teach their child to count just as well. Second, you had the Amazon effect. Parents also realized they could buy Melissa and Doug wooden toys, which were virtually identical to ELC toys, on Amazon for 20% less with free delivery. This digital disruption hit exactly when the parent company was least equipped to handle it. Mothercare was already suffocating under the weight of its own outdated infrastructure by being trapped in cavernous stores that were too expensive to run and bound by astronomical rents that were bleeding the balance sheet dry. So, rather than serving as the strategic lifeboat that saved the business, ELC simply became another heavy leak in an already sinking hull. To further compound all these problems, you had the real estate issue. Mothercare and ELC were burdened with legacy leases. In the UK, commercial leases are often 20 or 25 years long with upward-only rent reviews. That means that even if the value of the property drops, the rent can only go up. Mothercare was paying 2007 rents in a 2017 economy. By 2019, the situation had become terminal. If you look back at the archives, the entire media landscape was broadcasting the funeral. But just before the ship went down, Mothercare managed to throw the Early Learning Center overboard. In March 2019, months before the official collapse, Mothercare pulled the plug on ELC. After paying £85 million to acquire the business back in 2007, they offloaded it for just $13.5 million. That figure represents an 84% destruction of value, which is effectively pennies on the pound. The buyer was The Entertainer, a toy chain owned by Gary Grant. Now, Grant's a character who deserves a moment of focus. He's an old school retailer who founded his business in the early 80s on deeply held Christian principles. The most famous example is his refusal to open on Sundays. Even when Christmas Eve falls on a Sunday, The Entertainer keeps its doors locked, willingly forfeiting millions in revenue to stick to that code. Grant knew exactly what that £13 million was buying, and it certainly wasn't the physical shops. He recognized the high street locations were dead weight. Instead, he was paying for the memory, the nostalgia. He was acquiring the Happy Land trademark and the decades of trust parents placed in that little green logo. In a brilliant maneuver, he extracted the soul of the company and left the toxic assets of the store estate behind with Mothercare. This pivot brings us to what we call the parasite strategy. In nature, a smart parasite has no interest in building its own shelter because construction requires immense energy and resources that could be used for survival. Instead, the biological imperative is to seek out a host. In the retail ecosystem, the single most expensive line item for any shop is simply convincing a human being to walk through the front door. You either pay for this privilege via astronomical high street rents, or you burn cash on digital marketing to chase traffic online. Gary Grant looked at the landscape and realized he didn't need to incur those costs if he could just attach the brand to a host that had already solved the problem. Marks & Spencer was the perfect candidate. They had millions of customers walking through their doors every single week, and crucially, these were parents and grandparents who valued quality and were comfortable paying a premium for it. From the Marks & Spencer perspective, the partnership solved a glaring operational weakness. While the department store dominated the market for school uniforms and kidswear, their attempts to capture the toy market had historically fallen flat. Manufacturing toys is a logistical nightmare involving strict safety regulations, complex molding processes, and expensive licensing deals. It was a specialized game that M&S, with its focus on food and fashion, simply didn't have the expertise to play. This created the conditions for a perfect symbiotic relationship. A deal was struck to embed ELC directly inside M&S, but this went far deeper than a standard wholesale arrangement. Instead of M&S simply buying crates of stock to resell, they entered a strategic partnership where the entertainer retained control over curation and supply, while M&S provided the prime real estate and the captive audience. Marks & Spencer initially introduced ELC products strictly on their website, using the online store as a low-risk testing ground to see if their core customer base would actually bite. The data must have been compelling because the transition from digital test to physical reality happened at lightning speed. M&S began installing full-scale shop-in-shops across their estate. But instead of just shoving a few generic shelves into a corner, they fully resurrected the physical experience, bringing back the original branding, the distinct color palettes, and even the play tables. If you visit the M&S at Bluewater or Longbridge today, you'll find a dedicated zone that feels exactly like the ELC of old, only this time it's entirely sustained by the M&S ecosystem. This move effectively respawned the brand by capitalizing on a seamless trust transfer. A parent who hadn't seen an ELC for 5 years suddenly rediscovered it within the safe confines of their favorite retailer. The logic was instinctive. Marks & Spencer is arguably the most trusted name on the British High Street, so if they were vouching for these toys, the brand remained safe. Usually, when a brand gets bought out of administration, it becomes a zombie brand. Think of Polaroid. The Polaroid TV you see in a supermarket has nothing to do with the original camera company. It's just a logo slapped on cheap electronics. Or think of what happened to Comet or even Debenhams, which exist now purely as websites selling drop-shipped goods. ELC avoided this fate. Because the entertainer is a toy company, they actually cared about the product. The Happy Land sets are still compatible with the ones from 10 years ago, and the wooden puzzles are still wood. This is because the entertainer understands that the value of ELC is the trust. If they started selling cheap, brittle plastic toys in ELC boxes, the M&S shopper would reject it immediately. The Marks & Spencer shopper is paying a premium for quality. ELC had to maintain its better toys philosophy to survive inside the M&S ecosystem. This evolution proved that the physical shop isn't the brand. For 40 years, people have confused the two. We thought ELC was the shop with the green sign. When the shop disappeared, we thought ELC was dead. But the brand was actually the philosophy of developmental play and the trust parents had in the product. As long as that survived, the distribution channel could change. By decoupling the brand from the real estate liability, ELC became no longer exposed to the brutal economics of the high street lease market. If M&S decides to close a specific store, ELC just moves to another one. It also allows them to expand internationally much easier. Instead of having to build supply chains and rent stores in Dubai or Singapore, they can just find a local host and plug the ELC module into it. This story is essentially a Rorschach test for how you view capitalism. On the one hand, we lost the standalone toy shop, the independent spaces that were dedicated purely to children. Thousands of staff lost their jobs when Mothercare collapsed and the old ELC stores closed. We can't gloss over that. Real people lost their livelihoods in the transition. The efficiency of the Parasite model came at a human cost. On the other hand, it's a triumph of adaptation. By all rights, ELC should be in the graveyard next to the original Toys R Us, which, as a side note, has resurrected recently, not with massive stores, but as small concessions inside WH Smith. Regardless, ELC had already shown how effective this parasitic strategy could be, proving that you don't need huge high street shops to succeed. But what do you reckon? Is the Parasite strategy a stroke of genius that saved a heritage brand, or does buying a premium toy next to a packet of Percy Pigs just feel wrong? Are you team nostalgia, missing the magic of standalone shops, or are you team convenience, happy that you can pick up a birthday present at the same time as your meal deal? Drop your thoughts in the comments section below, and if you enjoyed this deep dive, give us a thumbs up, hit subscribe, and don't forget to ring that bell so you don't miss out on the next video. Cheers for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.